Hello, everybody. Welcome this week to our Prevention Science Across the Lifespan conversation. This week, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Denise Gottfredson from the University of Maryland. And Dr. Gottfredson, as you all will learn this week, was very instrumental in writing up the Society for Prevention Research Standards of Evidence for Efficacy, Effectiveness, and Scale Up. So we're going to be talking a lot about that today. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask Dr. Gottfredson, how are you doing? And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your professional background is, and maybe a little bit about what your favorite thing about prevention science is?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My professional background is I got my PhD from Johns Hopkins University, Department of Social Relations, where I specialized in the sociology of education. I stayed on at Hopkins for 6 years as a research scientist in an educational research center. And then I joined the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, where I stayed until I retired just 3 years ago. My main research interest long-term is in school safety and school climate. I began my career studying what it was about schools as organizations that contributed to school safety. And I conducted a number of different tests of preventive interventions in schools. These interventions were aimed at improving the social climate of schools and improving disciplinary practices and so forth. My favorite thing about prevention science, there are many things that I really like about prevention science, but I think probably my favorite thing is that it encourages researchers to work closely with practitioners, helping them develop effective practices and test them. I always enjoyed that work, especially working with people who are working on the front lines. It's a bit of a challenge often to do high quality research under real life circumstances, but I always found that to be a challenge, and I really liked that aspect of prevention science.
Great. So, why do you feel it is important for the field of prevention science to publish standards of evidence?
Well, it's important mainly because the word evidence means different things to different people. And that became very clear many years ago, 25 years ago, in the field, as the amount of research on preventive interventions increased. There became a need for groups to try to summarize what the research on these interventions was telling us. So a lot of different groups sprung up whose mission was to read the research and come to some conclusion about what works and what doesn't work to prevent whatever the behaviors were. Well, when that happened, we discovered that these different groups came to different conclusions about what worked and what didn't work. And the reason was that they were using different standards to apply to the research evidence and to guide their decisions about what works. So that resulted in a number of different lists of what works that provided contradictory information. So obviously that was a big problem for the field. You may as well not have the research if people can't agree on what the research is telling us. So to address that problem, the Society of Prevention Research developed an initial set of standards, and that was back in 2005. And that attempt was really to try to increase the consistency across reviews of prevention research. That initial set of standards was developed by a committee that was led by Brian Flay, and it was published in Prevention Science in 2005. And it turned out that that set of standards proved to be very useful in helping to develop a consensus about what standards should be applied to preventive research in order to claim that an intervention was or was not effective. It also, I think, drove the field to set a higher bar for the quality of research, because it clearly stated what the research had to look like in order for us to be able to use the research to make decisions about what worked.
Great. So, so you mentioned that Dr. Flay wrote the first version of the standards of evidence in 2005, and then you published a paper with colleagues from the Society for Prevention Research in Prevention Science in 2015. So it sounds like these standards of evidence can evolve over time. Can you describe how they can evolve? Yeah,
that's exactly what was happening. So a decade after the initial standards were published, the board of directors of SPR decided it was time to revisit those initial standards and to update them, because although they were quite comprehensive, there were some areas that had become more important in the field that were glossed over in the initial standards. At that time, the SPR board particularly wanted refined and upgraded standards to guide decisions about replication studies in the field, because the original initial set of standards had called for replication studies, but it didn't really provide any detail about what was a replication study, what should be considered a replication study, and especially once there were several studies, how should the information across those multiple studies of a particular intervention be summarized? I mean, should we require that every single study show significant positive results, or was it good enough to have the preponderance of the evidence? So there were issues like that needed to be thought through. The board at that time also wanted more guidance about prerequisites for scaling up interventions, because as we got more and more research, it became possible to think about scaling, bringing some of those effective interventions to scale. And the initial standards hadn't addressed that issue at all. So there was a real need to think about what does the field need? What kind of research does the field need in order to declare that a certain intervention was ready to be scaled up for broader evidence? So the new committee, which I chaired, basically reviewed all of the initial standards, tinkered with existing standards, and then made some fairly major changes to the replication area, and also added a whole section on standards for scaling up. We've made a lot of changes, and there are too many changes to go through all of them now, but many of the changes to the standards were made because we recognized the need to begin early in the research process to lay groundwork for later stages in the research. So in other words, as an intervention is being developed and piloted and initially tested, certain things needed to be done to make it easier to conduct replication studies later on, and even later down the line to scale the intervention up. So just a couple of examples. We know that when interventions are brought into a broader field under more usual circumstances, implementation differs from the original studies. And so we needed to set some standards about how those initial studies needed to describe the level of implementation that was necessary in order to achieve the results that were achieved. So just describing what the intervention is, describing what the key components of the intervention are, measuring the quality of implementation of those key components. Those are very important things that need to be done early in the research process in order to guide the later stages. Another example is just being very clear about the populations for whom the intervention is intended, and that needs to be done early on as well. Mm-hmm. So those are just a couple of examples of how the standards evolved over time.
Great, great. Well, so shifting gears just a little bit, and then we'll kind of circle back to how you think they may shift in the future. So our students are going to be reading about mediation and moderation. They're going to be reading about David McKinnon's work in this space. Well, why is it that why is it so important to understand mediation and moderation from a prevention science perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, because it's great to know what works and what doesn't work, but it's even more important to know why something works. Mm-hmm. And for whom it works. That knowing why, or knowing the theory underlying the intervention, helps us to generalize beyond the particular intervention components to a more general theory of the intervention. And so in a sense, knowing the theory helps to guide later refinements of the intervention, helps people to know what can be dropped, what can't be dropped, what kinds of components might be added to an intervention, and so forth. So that's very important. And then, of course, understanding for whom the intervention works and under what conditions it works is very, very important, because that helps us to generalize the results of the research to larger populations than were initially tested. So we thought about and added standards related to both of those issues. First, we added standards early on in the development of the intervention, stating that the theory underlying the intervention must be stated during the development of the intervention, and also that theory needed to be tested in the early stages of the intervention. And the whole idea there is to just help us understand what are the mechanisms through which the intervention is working. We also added standards stating that the intended target population for the intervention must be specified in advance. And we had a number of different standards that required researchers to actually test their claims of generalizability. So if they said the intervention is effective for X, Y, and Z group, then the researchers needed to actually show that the intervention was effective for those groups.
Great. So the testing mediation allows us to identify how or why our intervention works, which is great for understanding kind of the underlying theory and demonstrating, hey, this intervention works the way that we think it works. And then the moderation helps us understand for whom the intervention works. And ideally, we're hoping that the intervention is working for many different groups of participants, including those that are marginalized or minoritized. How are issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice taken into consideration when establishing the evidence for prevention programs, practices, and policies? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's primarily through those standards that I just mentioned, about the importance of being very clear about which subpopulations are intended to be influenced by the intervention, and then rigorously testing those claims. So, for example, if a developer states that an intervention is effective for students of color or middle school students or for rural populations, it's important for the researcher to collect enough data on all of those different subpopulations and to perform the appropriate statistical tests to demonstrate that the effectiveness of the intervention is equivalent across all those groups, or at least that it is effective for all those different groups. So that's the primary way that the standards address those issues.
Great. So now circling back to the future, how do you think, or what do you think are the next steps for prevention science in terms of establishing evidence?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we refined the standards in 2015, we knew that several of the standards that we were establishing at that time represented fairly major changes to the way the field was operating at the time. And in fact, several times the committee members debated for a long time about whether or not it was useful to set such a high standard that seems so difficult to reach at the particular time, especially with the current funding realities and so forth. But we always came down on the side of setting the standard high with the idea that we wanted to encourage growth in the field. So the result was that the standards were a little bit intimidating at the time. There were some, not all the standards, but some of them were a little bit intimidating. But we made clear that this is where we thought the field should be in 10 years from then. So I think a reasonable goal for now, or a reasonable next step, would be to assess where the field is in terms of the standards that we set in 2015, and just try to get a handle on which of the standards have been largely met, which ones we're still struggling to meet, and then try to make changes to the funding, the availability for funding. I mean, one example is the standard about theory testing that I mentioned earlier, where, you know, it really was not common in the field for developers of interventions to go to the trouble of measuring the mediating variables, the mechanisms through which the interventions work, and testing to see whether the intervention actually affected those. So that was an example of a standard that really set quite a high bar. So now I think a reasonable step would be to make an assessment about, you know, what percentage of the tests of new interventions do include tests of the theory underlying the intervention. And if we're not quite there yet, then we need to work with funding agents. I mean, maybe one of the problems is that many of the funding sources aren't willing to support those kinds of tests. So some work probably will have to be done to change that.
All right, thank you. So a lot of this establishing of standards for evidence comes from more of the research end of the spectrum rather than the practitioner end of the prevention spectrum. Many of our students are either current or soon to be prevention practitioners. So why is it important for prevention practitioners to be familiar with the evidence for prevention?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I began my career, we had very little rigorous research to guide prevention practices. So practitioners in the field would implement whatever was readily available, what their colleagues were using, what was vigorously marketed. Research really didn't play too much of a part in decisions about what to do. And we know now that led to a lot of wasted effort and actually even harm to clients. There were lots of very popular interventions at the time that we now know were ineffective. Things like DARE, drug abuse resistance education, which I don't know if your students will have heard of that, but it was a substance abuse prevention program run by police in elementary schools. That was in, you know, almost all the elementary schools in the United States. Another intervention that was very popular was something called midnight basketball. The idea was that kids needed to get off the streets at night. And so kids were gathered together and made to play basketball at midnight. So anyway, these are interventions that were very, very popular. Now we know they were ineffective. Some of them were even counterproductive, things like the scared straight intervention, where kids were brought into prisons to learn what it was like to be, to live in a prison. We know that that actually increased crime rather than decreased crime. Yet it was very popular. Prevention practitioners used those kinds of interventions all the time. So anyway, it's a very different world now. We know so much more about what works and what doesn't work than we did 25, 30 years ago. And in my view, to ignore that valuable information is really a malpractice these days, because it's the information about what works is so readily available now. It just would be a shame not to use all of the research that we've amassed in the past 25, 30 years.
Well, that's great advice. Great insight there. So that was the last question that I had for you. I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. I know that our students are really going to benefit from this conversation, and it really does. It's going to preview very well the content that they're going to be engaging with over this next module. So I think that that's going to be great. And I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Gottfredson, and I'll talk to you later.
Okay, you're very welcome.
All right, bye.
Bye.